From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk Radio Network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. A reassessment of the presidency of Jimmy Carter with his chief White House domestic advisor. Rather than a failed presidency, was Carter one of the best one-term presidents in American history to go along with being the consensus best ex-president in history? That's tonight on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Stuart Eizenstat was President Jimmy Carter's chief White House domestic advisor. He served President Clinton as U.S. ambassador to the European Union, Under Secretary of Commerce, Under Secretary of State, Deputy Secretary of Treasury. And under President Obama, he was Special Representative of the Secretary of State on Holocaust-era issues, now an international lawyer in Washington, D.C. An epic book he's just written, President Carter, The White House Years. Welcome, Stu.
Jim, thank you very much.
Honor to have you. And I have to admit, I was a registered Republican, and I voted for Jimmy Carter. And 2 years after that election, nobody in America admitted they voted for him, but I did. I want to start off with something that to me is Carter's greatest oratory, and it was before the presidency.
At the end of a long campaign, I believe I know our people of this state as well as anyone could. Based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over.
All right, Stu, first off, that may have gotten him elected on that Time cover. You can comment on that. My second part of that is, why didn't he ever match that when he was president?
So it's very interesting, Jim. I had worked in the Johnson White House, LBJ's White House, after Harvard Law School, and then when he decided not to run for re-election for Hubert Humphrey's presidential campaign, when he lost, I came back to Atlanta, clerked for a federal judge, and then met Jimmy Carter. And I became his policy director in the 1970 gubernatorial campaign. And what attracted me to him is exactly what you played, and that is I found here was a young former state senator running from a gnat-infested 500-person hamlet in southwest Georgia. And yet he was very strongly in favor of civil rights. That was the initial attraction to me. He told me that he had grown up in a county, Sumter County, that was two-thirds black, that all of his playmates, but not schoolmates in the segregated South, were black, and that when he came back from the nuclear navy of Hammond Rickover to take over his family business in Plains, Georgia, the first thing he did, Jim, was run for county board of education in Sumter County, and the reason was he wanted to lift the educational level of all people, and he was shocked to find that the black students, teenage students, Jim, were given seats for 4- and 5-year-olds, that they had no books. And this ingrained in him a sense of the need to end discrimination. And he not only said that in his inaugural, he hung the portrait of Martin Luther King Jr. in the state capitol, hardly popular at the time, and he took that same commitment into the White House. He, a Southern president, appointed more African Americans, and women, by the way, to federal judgeships and senior positions than all 38 presidents combined before him. He supported affirmative action for African Americans and for Hispanics and for women. So this was a abiding commitment of his, and it was what really attracted him to me at the very outset.
Did it bother you that he didn't seem to match that kind of visionary oratory when he was in D.C.?
But he did.
He did?
He did. He appointed more African Americans.
Oh, in substance-wise.
More women as president than all 38 presidents put together in the really tough Bakke Supreme Court case where white applicant for a medical school in California contended there was reverse discrimination because of the affirmative action program for African Americans. He insisted that we support the affirmative action program. He supported minority set-asides for black contractors to get government jobs, to give them a boost. So he very much carried that with him. And even though we lost in a crushing re-election in 1980 to Ronald Reagan, his strongest base of support from start to finish were African Americans. They understood that he knew their plight. He had grown up among them. He saw the discrimination. And interestingly, Jim, even at the Naval Academy, and this is well documented, there was only one black midshipman, and he was harassed horribly. And that black midshipman has said, and I quote it in the book, that Jimmy Carter was the one who led the effort to end that harassment. So this was an abiding issue of his that he carried with him to the White House to the very last day in office.
Yeah, I should say that the book, which is very long, 900 pages, really makes the point over and over how much little we know about the substantive accomplishments. I have to tell you this story briefly. President Carter, outside of office, came to Greenwich and spoke in our church. Tom Watson had been his ambassador to the Soviet Union, got him there. It was packed. And at the end, he said, now come on down and visit us. You know, I teach Sunday school. So we're driving to Florida. I tell my wife, well, he invited us. We're going to show up. We get to the church, and he's sitting in a pew on the right side by himself, and no one's talking to him before the service. So, of course, I obnoxiously go right up and said, you know, you invited us here, and I'm here. And he remembered the church that he had spoken and how beautiful it was. So he's really got a human touch. My question, why are you writing this this now?
That's a very good question. And the reason is that I felt that over the decades, his political hero had been Harry Truman. He put his famous slogan, "The buck stops here," in his Oval Office desk. Truman is now remembered more for his achievements than his failures. And while both left office highly unpopular, I thought it was important to put the presidency of Jimmy Carter in a more realistic light. And I do not ignore in my book, and that's why it's gotten great reviews in the New York Times and Washington Post and even the National Review. I don't ignore the problems we had, Jim.
Yeah, you're very honest.
Inexperience by himself and his Georgia Mafia inter-party warfare, but those all obscured huge accomplishments. He passed almost 70% of all his major legislation, just under the percentage of the master of the Congress, LBJ, who was the first president I worked for. And so I wanted to write a book that would put his presidency in a full perspective, not ignoring these problems, not obscuring them, not whitewashing the problems, but putting the accomplishments in a very real text. And the authenticity of the book, the candidness of the book is based on over 5,000 pages of contemporaneous notes of every meeting I had in the White House, verbatim, over 350 interviews of all the people in the administration and outside the administration, Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, 5 times with he alone. And it gave me a unique view of President Carter, but I think of the presidency of itself, the sort of hothouse atmosphere in which you work. And so I really wanted to write a book that put the presidency in greater perspective, that mentioned, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss them, the very real and lasting accomplishments, both at home and abroad, notwithstanding the problems that we had.
Okay, I want to get to some of those challenges, but first I want to say I've long felt this. Reagan gets a lot of credit for starting this boom that lasted for 20 years. I think perhaps Carter's greatest accomplishment, and the person responsible for that boom, was really Paul Volcker.
Yes, so let's look at the inflation issue, which was one of the, as I call it, 4 I's, along with inexperience and inter-party warfare in Iran, that did us in. We inherited, Jim, a decade-long inflation. It started with Nixon because of the oil embargo. He had imposed wage and price controls. It continued with Ford, who had the sort of infamous whip inflation now program with the win buttons. And it got worse in our administration, in part because of the Iranian Revolution that doubled the price of oil. We had the same problem that Nixon had with the Yom Kippur oil embargo. Oil prices quadrupled, gas lines, and so forth. So here's what Carter did. From the very outset, and this is a Democratic president, imagine, who had run against the Ford recession. And while we did propose and passed tax cuts to stimulate the economy, as early as April of 77, just 3 months after his inauguration, he gave the first of 3 major anti-inflation speeches. He appointed 2 anti-inflation czars, cut social spending to try to balance the budget, which made him unpopular with the liberal wing. had wage and price guidelines with procurement sanctions. Everything failed. And he said to us going into a re-election, he said, look, I have tried everything. Nothing has worked. I do not want my legacy to be double-digit inflation, even if it means my loss in 1980 to Reagan. And so I'm going to take the stiff medicine and appoint Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve, knowing, because Volcker told him a very famous incident in the Oval Office that I described in the book. And what Volcker told him, Jim, was the only way we can deal with this decade-long embedded inflation and inflation psychology is tight money, higher interest rates, and higher unemployment.
And this Business Talk with Jim Campbell, Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. Go to biztalkradio.com, find the station closest to you, listen over the internet, get our podcast. We'll be right back with Stu Eizenstat. Back with President Carter's chief White House domestic advisor, Stu Eizenstat. You wanted to finish up on those thoughts, Stu?
Yeah, Jim, thank you. Knowing what Volcker was going to do and the political as well as economic pain, he never once complained, and Volcker credits him for letting him do his job of squeezing inflation out of the system the hard way. It didn't help us for our re-election because inflation didn't go down quickly enough. It helped Ronald Reagan in his first 2 years when it did, and helped the country ever since. Volcker deserves the credit for doing it. Carter deserves the credit for appointing him and letting him do his job. And in the meantime, Jim, since this is, of course, a business talk radio, we also created 10 million jobs in that 4-year period. That's more than any president in a 4-year period until Bill Clinton's term in his first 4 years in office.
And I'll say in this book, you'll notice a lot of decisions President Carter made were long-term in nature. He took a short-term hit, and really as sort of an anti-politician lived through to that. But I do want to talk about a couple challenges now before we get to his legacy. Ran as a populist outsider. Ham Jordan said if you point Vance and Brzezinski, it's a failed deal before we start. Did he govern to status quo? And the second point is, I've interviewed Chris Whipple several times, who's now the expert on chief of staffs, and he says the chief of staff determines the success of a presidency. Reagan got that with Jim Baker. Carter appeared not to get that.
Yes. So we had a dilemma. He had run, in a way like Donald Trump, as an outsider, anti-Washington. This was in the immediate post-Watergate era. I'll never lie to you. And the dilemma all along when he was actually elected and in the Oval Office is how do you keep that outsider status when you have to govern inside? It's a dilemma we never quite squared. And I think it was complicated by the fact that he brought in to the White House his Georgia Mafia, many of whom were talented, but he didn't leaven it with experienced Washington people who could help him navigate the treacherous landmines in Washington. And another mistake he made, over my objection, was he decided to be his own chief of staff for the first 2 years. He drew the wrong lesson, I think, from the Nixon era. Yes, Haldeman, who was the chief of staff, blocked Nixon off from all the people who should have been advising him. He was ruthless. But the problem was Haldeman's and his personality. It was not the chief of staff. You need to have a chief of staff to set priorities, to make sure that he's on the right course. And that didn't happen until halfway into the administration when he appointed Ham Jordan, and then Ham was diverted by a false charge of snorting cocaine. So we really never had a full-time chief of staff until the very last year of the administration with Jack Watson.
And I'll say Chris Whipple thinks Jack Watson would have been great all 4 years. I want to talk now about what I call a little bit failed fusion of opposites, and I'll give you what I'm talking about. Vice President was Mondale, fundamentally much more liberal than Carter. Foreign policy, Vance, Brzezinski, completely different views. You say they're both good, but not together. And, of course, then you have the new Democrat thing. He was focused on balancing budget and inflation versus what liberal Democratic spending would have called for. Were those failed opposites that he put together?
Well, first of all, Mondale was appointed as vice president because he was more liberal, because he had ties to the labor movement that Carter, as a Southern governor, did not. that he had ties to the liberal establishment, that he was an insider. He had been senator for several terms. And it was a good balance. I think that Mondale understood that Carter was more conservative. He understood he was not elected in 1976 against Ford to create a new great society. And what we often did is at the end of a budget cycle, Jim, Mondale and I would go into the private residence, and we would ask Carter to add back about $1 billion to the budget to deal with Head Start and programs that would help liberals. But they really, I think, were a very good match. Now, at the end, Mondale almost resigned over the Malaise speech, and we can talk about that. The Vance-Brzezinski problem was more fundamental because they had opposite views of the key issue facing Carter, and that is the Soviet Union. Cy Vance was a diplomat, a very good one, but his notion was managing the Soviet Union. Spig, who was Polish-born and academic, a great thinker, was a much more hardline person. And I told Carter during the transition, after we won in 76, and during a break in one of the first CIA briefings, I was the only staff person to attend, and he told me, Jim, he said, I'm thinking of appointing Cy as Secretary of State and Spig as National Security Advisor. What do you think? And I had worked, of course, with both of them as policy director during the campaign. I said, look, either one, Jim, would be great, but not together. Yes. And he said, why? And I said, because they have fundamental differences on the fundamental issue that's going to face you in foreign policy, which is the Soviet Union. He said, I can take care of it. I like different views. Well, it really created a dissonance in our foreign policy, looking one way and the other, often stitching together their views. It was not until the Afghan invasion, Christmas of 1979, by the Soviet Union, that he clearly went into Zbig's hardline view, and even his conservative critics state that he did courageous things after the Afghan invasion. We armed the Mujahideen. Reagan continued that. We created the Carter Doctrine, saying that any further entrance into the Persian Gulf would be met with military force. We had the grain embargo only 3 weeks before the Iowa primary. We had the Olympic boycott, remembering the lessons of the 1936 Olympics. And
up the defense budget, too.
Yes. And all of the major weapon systems, and we talk about inflation, the sort of flip side of this is Carter had human rights as a major part of foreign policy and applied it to the Soviet Union, reaching out to the dissident movement, the Soviet Jewish movement, but he also set in place all the weapon systems that Reagan then built on, the intermediate nuclear forces in Europe, the MX mobile missile, the stealth bomber. He increased defense spending 3%, and after the Afghan invasion, 5%, and got our NATO allies to do the same. So many of the defense foundations that Reagan put in place were built on what we started, particularly after the Afghan invasion, and that's when, again, this split between Vance and Carter ended. I've always felt, and I interviewed Vance, he resigned after the failed hostage rescue. Right. But I'm convinced, Jim, that the real reason he did was he realized that his more dovish policy toward the Soviet Union had now fallen out of favor with the president.
All right, we're down to a couple minutes here. I want to start with his legacy stuff. Obviously, the biggest one, Camp David. I didn't realize how every one of his advisors was against it. Talk about Camp David, the big points.
So in foreign policy, he did a great many things. We normalized relations with China. We put human rights at the center of foreign policy. But clearly, his most important and lasting accomplishment was the Camp David Accords and then the Egypt-Israel peace treaty which followed. And it's a great example of symmetry and how it should be done. He invited Prime Minister Begin of Israel and President Anwar Sadat of Egypt to Camp David after Sadat's historic visit to Jerusalem had not produced the kind of breakthrough that we had hoped. He studied CIA reports endlessly about the two. What were their red lines? What could they accept and what couldn't they? And then during 13 agonizing days and nights, he, Carter, drafted 20 different peace agreements. He negotiated separately with the two, with Begin and Sadat, because they were like two scorpions in a bottle. They couldn't negotiate with each other. He took them to Gettysburg on the first Sunday of the 13 days to underscore that 5 wars were enough. And then, Jim, at the very end, after all these 20 drafts, 13 agonizing days and nights, we were close but not quite there, and Prime Minister Begin said, Mr. President, I can't go any further. I can't make any concessions. I'm not bluffing. I've got an El Al plane waiting to take me back. Carter, realizing this would destroy his initiative and inflame the Middle East after Sadat's courageous action of going to Jerusalem, knew that Begin had a great love for his grandchildren. He got photographs of himself, Begin, and Sadat at Camp David, wrote each of the 8 grandchildren's names on the photo, walked them over to Begin's cabin, handed it to him, and then watched Begin read each of their names, his eyes tearing, his lips quivering. He put his bags down and he said, "Mr. President, I'll make one last try. The rest is history, Jim. 40 years, never a violation. They're now allies against Iran. It's one of the great lasting achievements of Jimmy Carter's presidency, and it's symmetry at its best. Real preparation, understanding people, knowing the issues well enough to draft the agreement yourself, being a great personal negotiator."
More legacy highlights coming right up. We're back with Stu Eizenstat. He's the author of President Carter, The White House Years, an epic document reassessing the presidency of Jimmy Carter. One more thing on the Middle East peace accomplishment. It's been 40 years with no violations. Why has no other president had any success with expanding the peace?
And I think the reason explains much about the way Carter approached the presidency. He was a ferocious campaigner, but he believed in parking politics at the Oval Office door and then taking on Panama and the Middle East and energy when they were politically unpopular. So he cracked a lot of eggs to reach this agreement. Other presidents have not been willing to do so. One of the lost things in our peace treaty with Egypt was, quote-unquote, full autonomy for the Palestinians. I'm convinced had Carter been reelected, he would have put enough pressure on all parties to achieve that autonomy. Future presidents simply weren't willing to risk the political problems of pushing for the Palestinians. Carter did, and I think, unfortunately, that full autonomy has never been fully achieved.
Stu, we talked about the hands-on nature of this. He even negotiated directly with people below the top levels in government. If I turn to the Iran hostage situation, did that level of control end up hurting him? He personalized the crisis, almost held himself hostage himself.
Yes. I'm very frank in the book about a number of things, and in particular Iran. This was the coup de grace to the whole Carter presidency. Now, I don't think it's fair to blame Carter for the Iranian Islamic Revolution any more than it would be to blame President Eisenhower for the communist revolution by Castro. But I believe it was the single worst intelligence disaster in modern times, at least until the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and maybe more so. The CIA, Jim, did not know and did not tell the president that the Shah of Iran, our great ally upon whom we had 6 presidents given tens of billions of dollars of aid, did not realize his political support rested on quicksand. They didn't realize, remarkably, this was our principal ally, that he was getting for 5 years cancer treatments. It was a horrible problem. And then once the hostage crisis occurred, both Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, and myself said, take immediate military action. That didn't mean bombing Tehran. What we argued for was mining the harbors to prevent oil from coming out, to choke their economy, to show that we mean business. Instead, he met with the hostage families and said, my number one priority was getting your loved ones out safe and sound, which he did, but at huge political cost. He holed himself up in the White House to show he was working full-time on this, canceled all his trips, didn't campaign against Kennedy, made no foreign trips, and this really backfired. As you said very well, Jim, it made him the hostage. It gave the Iranians more leverage. And if you're a member of the press, it created Ted Koppel's Nightline program. Walter Cronkite,
yes,
the Dean of American Reporting, every single night would end his broadcast, date 103, date 206, date 308 of the hostage crisis. And then the failed rescue effort did not fail because of too few helicopters. Indeed, Carter added more than the military wanted. It failed, Jim, because there had been no joint command at that time. We had 4 military services who were not used to working together. And when one of the helicopter rotors hit the C-130 cargo plane and caused the death of 8 people in flames, our administration went up in flames metaphorically as well.
And the JSOC now exists. I've interviewed McRaven and McChrystal. That's the Joint Special Ops Inter-Service.
Yes, and we created that joint.
I was going to say, yeah. Now, let me ask you briefly, the Malaise speech, in which he never used that word, actually did bump the administration up, but then seemed to collapse when he fired all the wrong people. And, of course, you have your huge Mondale revelation in there.
Yes, so Carter, in effect, our energy security depends on him. He was a great consumer champion. He was the greatest environmental president since the TR put ethics in. But even with that, his popularity was declining because of the inflation problems and high unemployment in Gasland. So he came back from the G7 summit in Tokyo, canceled the energy speech we had written for him, went to Camp David, met for 10 days with the so-called best and brightest to try to write his presidency, and then came up with a speech which was called the Crisis of Confidence speech. It caused huge problems. Mondale and I strongly urged him not to do so. But it turned out that the Crisis of Confidence speech, which he did not use the term malaise, the press later called it, it was actually an upbeat speech about how we could restore confidence in our institutions. It was hugely successful, Jim. Mm-hmm. His polls went up 17% in one day. An older lady in the mailroom who had worked since President Roosevelt's time said she had never seen such an outpouring of positive mail. And then what happened? He surprisingly, and while telling Mondale, which is why Mondale almost resigned, he decided to ask for the resignations of the entire cabinet to show he was in charge, and then fired a couple. He could have easily fired a couple rather than doing that, and all the momentum we got from that speech was evaporated, and that older lady said all the mail stopped. It was really tragic because we had really begun to restore the trust and confidence that we had lost.
All right, let's do some of these legacy highlights so you can give brief responses. Energy.
So, Jim, you talk about long-term implications. The energy security we feel today, the lack of dependence on OPEC oil, is due to the three major energy bills we passed. He deregulated the price of oil and gas, encouraging domestic production. We're now exporting that. He put conservation at the center of our consciousness. And he inaugurated the new alternative energy revolution with solar and wind, put even a solar panel on the White House. He was a great environmental president. He doubled the size of the national park system with the Alaska Lands Bill over the fierce opposition of the Alaska delegation. And again, he was a different kind of Democrat. He was a consumer champion who transformed over-regulated systems. For example, trucks, railroad, and airlines. Our air travel today, which is open to the Southwests and JetBlues, and competition, came because of our deregulation. We deregulated telecommunications and inaugurated the cable era. And those of your listeners who love local craft beers, we ended a prohibition regulation against competition from local craft beers. He put ethics and government reform at the center after Watergate, and those ethics reforms are still critical. The Ethics Act of 78, Inspectors General, and where did the Independent Counsel come from? That is now front page news. It came from us. Where did the Inspector Generals come when the Inspector General just issued a major report on the whole Hillary Clinton and Russia issues? Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, merit selection of judges.
Civil service reform, by the way, which isn't sexy, but...
Yes, civil service reform, more women and minorities appointed, and we saved, you're in Greenwich, but a lot of your listeners are in New York City, we saved New York City from total bankruptcy.
And Chrysler.
It would be the city it is today without it, and he created the modern vice presidency with Mondale, and that's only on domestic affairs.
Human rights.
Camp David, human rights, a tough position on the Soviet Union, both with soft power with human rights and hard power with building up our military, normalizing relations with China, the tough position on Afghanistan. All of these are legacy issues. And one very cute story is that Nixon and Kissinger get all the credit they deserve for reaching out to China, the One China policy, but they didn't establish diplomatic relations, Jim, because they didn't want to take on the Taiwan lobby, which was a key part of the Republican coalition. We did. We won. And when Deng Xiaoping came to the White House, I was in the cabinet room, he said to the president, I appreciate what you've done on diplomatic relations. What I want is the lowest tariff levels for our products, sound familiar, that you give to your most favored nation. She said, I know that the Soviet Union doesn't get that because they restrict immigration. We don't. He took a pencil and a piece of paper, he pushed it over to the president and said, you put on this piece of paper how many Chinese you'd like us to send you each year to show we have no limits on immigration. 1 million, 10 million? Carter laughed and said, I'll tell you what, I'll take 10 million Chinese a year if you'll take 10,000 American journalists a year. Of course, he had to fulfill that.
Hey, Stu, let me ask you this, because I didn't really know this. Carter really came somewhat close to health care, and it would have been no more than $1,250 cost per family, but Ted Kennedy really was responsible for it not happening.
Exactly. I mean, we lost the election in the end to Reagan because of Iran and inflation, but also because the Democratic Party was split when Ted Kennedy decided to run. And this is a tragedy in terms of health care. We had proposed a first-phase bill, Jim, which would have covered catastrophic coverage for everybody for huge expenses. It would have expanded Medicaid dramatically, and it would have covered every child under 6 years old. It was a $17 billion first-phase program in 1980. Ted Kennedy said it wasn't enough. He wanted cradle-to-grave, government-run health insurance, and it divided the party, and it prevented health care reform all the way up to President Obama. It would have been a major, major step forward. And it showed, in a sense, the problem that Carter had. He was a centrist. He believed in deregulating. But at the same time, he was sort of the first new Democrat, fiscal prudence, but dealing with poverty, dealing with discrimination. And being a centrist, he got hit from both sides. He was too liberal for the conservatives, too conservative for the liberals. And so Ted Kennedy took him on, never got that health insurance program cradle to grave that he wanted, and ours went down in flames because Kennedy didn't support it. At a time, we had a very substantial majority of Democrats in both the Senate and House. A real tragedy for the American public, but it said something about Carter as well. He was a centrist. He believed in taking some things from Republicans, some things from Democrats, and many of the great accomplishments, Jim, that we made, like the Panama Canal Treaty, which transformed our relationship with Latin America, as did our human rights policy toward it, occurred because of bipartisanship. Howard Baker, the Republican party leader, supported it.
And we're looking back at the Carter presidency, one final segment. Chief White House Domestic Advisor under President Carter, Stu Eizenstat. Stu, you had Iran, the misery index, Ted Kennedy running, the Cuban boat lift, debate gate. Is there any way that Carter could have been reelected?
With all of that, because of the other accomplishments we had in energy and environment and so forth, we actually went into the last 10 days, Jim.
That's right.
Even with Ronald Reagan. The key factors were the following. The debate only 8 days before the election. Reagan was a great debater. And as I show in the book, and as Jim Baker, his campaign manager, confirmed in one of my 350 interviews, they had stolen our debate book that I developed. They knew all of our attack lines. Now, that's not the only reason Reagan won the debate. He was a superior debater. Mm-hmm. But it really hurt us. And so we lost a tremendous amount of momentum, and then Iran came back to bite us. In the last weekend, we had regained a lot of what we lost from the debate. We were even. Some polls showed us ahead. It was the last offer that Iran made for the hostage crisis when we were in Chicago campaigning. At 3 o'clock in the morning, we went back to the White House. I begged him not to go back. I said, just look at the offer. It's not adequate. He said, no, I'm going to do everything possible. He went back to the White House. It revived the whole hostage crisis issue, and then our polls just dropped like a rock. So I think it still would have been possible. But again, the twin burdens, Jim, of double-digit inflation and Iran were really almost too much for anybody to bear. We simply couldn't do it, and particularly with a divided party, with the Ted Kennedy primary challenge. So
it's hard to see. It's hard to see in today's world too that somebody sacrificing and doing the right thing for the short term and sacrificing their presidency. Let me ask you this: where do you rank Carter quickly versus why not the best, which is his standard, and versus one-term presidents and then all?
Well, you know, the American people, and I suppose rightly so, love winners. When you win an election, you're viewed as positive regardless of what you've done. When you lose, you're judged a failure. I think he should go down, and I don't nominate him for a place on Mount Rushmore.
Yes.
But I do think he belongs in the foothills with many other presidents who made major contributions despite the problems we had. major contributions that I've mentioned today in energy and environment and ethics and appointing women and breaking the back of inflation by having Volcker and human rights and Camp David and China normalization and military buildup, all of these things I think should put him in a quadrant with being a very, very accomplished one-term president and being equal to many two-term presidents. So was he a great president? No. Was he a good and accomplished president? Yes.
Okay, two what-ifs. What would have been different if Burt Lance had stayed? And number two, what would he have accomplished in the second term that was big in your mind that would have been on the agenda?
Burt Lance was his top advisor in Georgia. He was a great politician. He was appointed as the head of the Office of Management Budget. But he was also his link to the sort of Southern conservative base. He was his age. We were all 20 years younger. He could say to the president, you have no clothes. This is what you have to do. When we lost him, it was a great loss. He hung on to Burt too long because of the banking scandal. But losing him was an enormous loss because he lost a peer who could really tell him what needed to be said and in blunt terms. So it was an enormous loss to us, and I think he never fully recovered from it.
Second term?
If there had been a second term, I think his priorities would have been to implement the Strategic Arms Nuclear Agreement. It would have been to fulfill the full autonomy for the Palestinians, and he would have been a beneficiary of the lower inflation. I'm also convinced that with that lower inflation that Volcker did bring to Reagan in the first 2 years, it would have cleared the air and we could have gotten that first phase health insurance program passed, which would have put us in a much better light.
So some big stuff, in other words. Let me ask you this. He ran as a populist, probably the first anti-Washington guy. Is Trump the natural outgrowth of this?
No, I think they both certainly ran as anti-Washington, but they had very different impressions. I mean, Carter's notion was, yes, Watergate was a problem. We had to bring ethics to the White House to let people decide whether Trump has done that or not. But what Carter wanted to do is make government work better, not destroy it. He wanted to bring us together. He appealed to our better angels, appointing women and blacks and being inclusive, not trying to divide it, not stoking grievances, not trying to upend the environment. So he wanted to make government more efficient, more deregulated, more consumer-oriented. He wanted to make it better, but he didn't want to destroy it. He wanted to make it ethical. He wanted to make it transparent. He wanted to put human rights at the centerpiece of our foreign policy, so our foreign policy reflected the best American values. He wanted to reach out to allies. We had great relations with Europe. The G7 summits were real productive. So we tried to rally, and did, our natural allies in Europe and Japan and Canada against the Soviet Union. We didn't try to attack them and divide them.
Okay.
So I think we're very different, although they both ran against Washington.
Okay, we'll do these last couple things briefly. The impact of Rosalind Carter, and I was impressed you say that she suggested Reuben Askew Chief of Staff, so she got the Chief of Staff issue.
Rosalind was a beautiful thing to watch. She was, in the early campaigning for governor, so shy, Jim, she hardly could speak. She hated public speaking.
Yeah.
She blossomed as First Lady. She became only the second First Lady next to Eleanor Roosevelt to testify in Congress. She developed her own community mental health bill and got it passed. She was his envoy to Latin America, gave him the tough medicine about human rights. And, yes, had great political instincts. She wanted Reuben Askew, who was the governor of Florida, to be the chief of staff. She realized he needed one. She told him things like, Jimmy, don't put in your first term Panama Canal. It's too controversial. Yeah. Wait till a second term. He would say, well, maybe there won't be a second term. She had great political instincts and really blossomed as a wonderful First Lady, a very significant one, and by the way, the only one to sit in on cabinet meetings. Yeah. She wanted to know what was happening. She wanted to be informed. And when he holed himself up after the hostage crisis and didn't campaign, all the burden of campaigning in the Democratic primaries against Ted Kennedy rested on her. She had a great sense of what the public was thinking and conveyed it back to him. He would have done better to listen to her more often.
Okay, if we finish up here, is a fundamental issue that he basically lacked a political personality. He just didn't fit in the D.C. whole deal and didn't like politics. And can a good man be a good president?
It's a great question. And ironically, again, we got almost 70% of our legislation passed because he met frequently with the Democratic leadership. What he didn't do is he didn't schmooze like Bill Clinton. He wasn't willing to trade off highways and so forth for votes. He said, this is the right thing to do and follow it. In many cases, it worked. But he forgot that a president is not only commander-in-chief, he has to be politician-in-chief. He has to nurture his base. This is certainly one thing Trump does well. He has to keep that base with him the entire time and not simply do the right thing, quote-unquote, and then hope at the end you'll be rewarded.
I have to say a good way to end this is I love what Vice President Mondale said at the end of the administration. We told the truth, we obeyed the law, we kept the peace. Thanks to Stu Eizenstat, people should take a look at President Carter, the White House years of quite a reassessment. Next, we have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on lessons he learned from his family. Thanks to Stu Eizenstat. Thanks to our national audience for listening. So everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Stu. And welcome now to our segment 5, which is Overtime. It's exclusively for Yale Radio. The quiet leadership of President George H.W. Bush and the inside story of how he presided over the end of the Cold War, a time when the world seemed new. That's tonight on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Jeffrey Engel is the founding director of the Center for the Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, where my nephew recently graduated. He was educated at Cornell, Oxford, where my dad graduated, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where my other nephew graduated, and Yale, where this show started. He has authored or edited 10 books on American foreign policy, including The Fall of the Berlin Wall, The Revolutionary Legacy of 1989, and The China Diary of George H.W. Bush, The Making of a Global President. And this book, just out, When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. Welcome, Jeff.
Hi, it's very good to talk to you.
So I see this guy as a really unsung one-term president, a real class act. His son got 2 terms, but I think he was a better president. You're not going to admit that, right?
Actually, no, I would have no problem saying that whatsoever. I think that George H.W. Bush, now that we know from everything that he did, from the opening of the diplomatic record and the classified records around the world, really needs to be reassessed and looked at as a president who guided the United States through one of the most dangerous periods in all of global history, and did so with a tremendous amount of restraint and grace.
How's his health?
Not great, but anybody who's in their mid-90s, I think, is more thankful than anything else.
Does he feel, or do you know if he feels vindicated at all? I mean, his Iraq war, in retrospect, looks like it was, a coalition. It was strategically limited goals versus what happened with his son's version of the Iraq war.
I'm always hesitant to put any words into the president's mouth, okay. But the vindication is a very interesting word, because my experience in interviewing the president and in interviewing all of his senior foreign policy officials in particular is that they didn't ever feel a need to be vindicated because they never felt they were wrong in the first place, which is to say they understood just how complex the situations they faced were, including the end of the Iraq war, and that once people really began to appreciate what they did, that is, once the record became open, they would have the world would basically appreciate more what they did. And I think that that's actually proven to be true, especially if you think about Iraq. In fact, James Baker, who was Bush's Secretary of State, of course, used to say that, people used to ask him all the time why it was that we didn't go all the way to Baghdad, why it was we didn't remove Saddam Hussein. And they said, around 2006, people stopped asking. Yeah, exactly, because they all the problems that were subsequently faced by America were, of course, readily apparent to the group in 91.
Character obviously was a core of George H.W. Bush. Would he think that the standards have gone way down? And I'm not just talking about Trump, who's obvious, but even going back to Bill Clinton. Does character not matter as much anymore? And also, does being prepared not matter anymore for the office?
Well, that's a place where I feel a little bit more comfortable putting words in the president's mouth, because I know what he thinks on this issue, which is that, yes, character is really critical. Character is really the defining aspect of a person's ability to operate in office. I mean, one of the things about the presidency that is really like real life, but is magnified a million times, is that we don't know what's going to happen next, and we don't know what crisis and what problem and what quandary is going to arise. And there is, in fact, no preparation for that, though I'll say more about preparation in a moment. There's no preparation, which means that character is really revealed in the Oval Office in many ways, that you are only going to do what you are as a person in those crises, and therefore you better have a good character. You also better be prepared, as Bush would say. In fact, Bush was arguably the single best prepared person to ever take over the Oval Office. He had been an ambassador for the United States twice. He had been a congressman. He'd been head of a national party. He'd been director of the CIA. He had been, of course, vice president for 8 years before that. And so he really, more than anyone else, was prepared for the White House and still found the problems really revealing of his own character and stressful in words that he never could have imagined.
You know, I compare him to Al Gore in one way, which is that Bush is apparently a very engaging and charismatic guy behind the scenes, but that essential personality, he wouldn't reveal it to the public. And Gore had that problem, too. Do you agree with that?
You know, I would. In fact, one of the things I write in the book, and after studying Bush for almost 20 years now, is I like to say words were not his friends. Yeah. That, you know, he was never comfortable using soaring rhetoric, and especially, of course, coming in the wake of Ronald Reagan, who was clearly one of the greatest orators we've ever had as a president. Bush was never comfortable letting the world in that way, and never comfortable trying to show his real face to the world. One of the problems that he faced throughout his administration, though I argue it's actually one of the best things he did throughout his administration, was essentially keep his mouth shut and essentially not say and not explain the complexities of what he was thinking and what was going on, because he knew that complex diplomatic negotiations in particular really needed to happen without public scrutiny, really needed to happen quietly. You need to give foreign leaders the time and the space to create the political environment they need in order to make deals with you. And so therefore, time and again, the press and the public came away with the impression that Bush was either not interested or not doing anything to major public crises, when we now know he actually was doing an incredible amount, just doing it quietly.
You talk about him practicing Hippocratic diplomacy. What do you mean by that?
Well, of course, referring to the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, that doctors are instructed. And that was basically Bush's approach to foreign policy. Remember, he came into office in 1989 at a time when everything seemed to be going America's way, quite frankly. The world was turning in a democratic fashion. The Cold War seemed to be transforming towards democracy. And we were incredibly popular, we, the United States, around the world as well. And so therefore, from Bush's perspective, these things were inevitable. He believed in democracy, he believed in freedom, he believed in the power of markets, and genuinely believed that if we are going in the right direction, the key to being a successful policymaker is to keep going in the right direction. That is to say, if you don't know how to handle a crisis, best not to do anything, because you're moving in the right way, and therefore you're more likely to crash by trying to steer than you are just simply to get through the bumps.
Interesting. Another thing that really sticks out to me, particularly what's going on currently, is the management of a foreign policy team, how close they were. And I'm talking Jim Baker, Scowcroft, Cheney. They really worked as a team.
Yeah, this group had known each other for many, many years. They had all worked together in one form or fashion under President Gerald Ford in the 1970s. And, of course, Jim Baker and George Bush were not only arguably best friends, but also tennis partners throughout their earlier years growing up together or working together in Houston. So this team knew each other, they trusted each other, and all of them in their own personal memoirs talk about the significance of trust, in that even though they're friends, Dick Cheney is still running the Pentagon. That's a massive organization. James Baker is running the State Department, a massive organization. And each of those organizations have their own interests and have their own bureaucratic cultures. So when the heads of those organizations, Baker, Cheney, Brent Scowcroft, National Security Advisor, could come together and trust each other to implement what they agreed to do, well, that just made the entire system work. And their system worked incredibly well because everybody below them knew that if their boss had given their word, they better be true to their boss's word.
Now, we're at 90% approval rating after the Gulf War, and then not much more than like 18 months later, he's thrown out of office. Is that kind of a Churchill thing, that he was needed for wartime but then expunged?
I think actually Churchill's a pretty good analogy there, though I would expand it from wartime in many ways just to times of stress and strife. When Bush comes into office, actually, let me back up, when Bush wins office in 1988, it's clear that the American people are full of anxiety. They're full of anxiety at home. Remember, this is a moment when crime and law and order is a big issue in the campaign, and they're really anxious about what this crazy man in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, seems to be doing. We should remember that we look back now and see the Cold War as inevitably collapsing by this period, but that's not at all clear. When Bush is running for president in 1988, it's very possible that Gorbachev is simply trying to dupe us, that he's trying some great Machiavellian scheme in order to rebuild the Soviet Union to counter us again, to make Russia great again, if you will. And so consequently, Bush is elected with this incredible foreign policy experience over Mike Dukakis, who has, to all of his credit, has no foreign policy experience. He's purely a domestic governor at that point. And Bush is elected, and then 4 years later, all those anxieties seem to be gone. That is to say, we won the Cold War, we won the Gulf War, the world is going our way, and consequently, the American people are looking for a change.
And now we'll go to the Gulf War, perhaps what he's best known for, and tremendous coalition building and success. But I was surprised at the beginning of it, how much initially it was about oil and how tentative they were. Talk about Desert Storm.
This is, I think, the moment in the book I'm most proud of, because we tried for over a decade to get access to some of the key initial records from the Bush administration, and finally did. And it really did tell a different story. We now know better. The initial reaction from the Bush administration to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 was essentially to recognize that maybe this isn't such a big deal. That's behind the scenes, that they said, what really matters about Kuwait is oil. That's the only reason anybody really cares about Kuwait is its oil. And Saddam Hussein is desperately poor at the end of the Iran-Iraq war and took over Kuwait because he wants to sell its oil. So if we care about oil, Saddam Hussein's about to make it not only available but cheaper. But this actually might be an economic boom for the rest of the world during a period where the Middle East is really the sole provider for oil throughout the world. So consequently, the initial, by which I mean the first few hours, reaction from American policymakers that maybe we just need to suck it up and let this one ride. It's only after reflection, after a few more hours, and after a few more days, that Bush and those around him come to the realization that no, what really matters here is not the oil, but the precedent. That is to say, if we allow Saddam Hussein to aggressively gobble up a new country, a neighbor, I should say, during this new period of the end of the Cold War, that's going to send a message to others that that's okay to do, that is the way the post-Cold War world will function, via force. And that was something that Bush could never consonant.
So, in retrospect, do you think that this thought that Ambassador Glaspie provided maybe inadvertently a green light, we don't get involved in border disputes, do you think that did loom large? And also, from what you said before, did Saddam have bigger goals from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia? Was there this sort of caliphate kind of vision or not?
Personally, and we know a lot from Saddam's records now, too, of course. I think he thought of himself less as the leader of a caliphate in the Middle East and more as a secular strongman who would be respected throughout the Middle East. I'm very hesitant to say what his ultimate plans were because I don't think he knew what his ultimate plans were. But there's no doubt that the initial plan for Hussein was to take Kuwait and then consolidate it into Iraq. He had no designs on Saudi Arabia during the initial conflict. Going back to Ambassador April Glaspie, she, of course, had famously told Saddam Hussein in the days leading up to the invasion that the United States has no opinion on the border dispute between Iraq and Kuwait that was the titular cause of the crisis. She was subsequently ridiculed and, in fact, run out of the Foreign Service eventually. The truth of the matter is what she did was actually both proper diplomatic protocol and language, and also in line with her instructions from Washington. That is to say, the United States doesn't take positions on border disputes around the world, largely because there are thousands and thousands of them, and we don't want to be involved in every border dispute. We don't want to arbitrate them. The only thing we care about, and this point she made clear, is that disputes cannot be decided through force and violence. And she was very clear with Saddam Hussein that force and violence was not going to be acceptable, and the United States would respond to that.
Do we have a similar thing that we had in ending the Cold War, which is because it was managed so flawlessly, it doesn't look as big as it was? I mean, I think in the book you make clear that the Middle East, there could have been a huge bloody fallout throughout the Middle East. We could have had an oil recession, as with the Cold War. We could have had civil wars or revolutions. Part of it, the reason he doesn't get the credit right is because it was managed so well.
I think that's exactly right. We really, as historians and as a public, don't focus on the moments where things work well, which are really quite sometimes more impressive and more complex than when things go badly. To take the broadest picture here, when the Soviet Union and European communism collapses, we need to recognize that that's really the end of an empire. And historically, going all the way back as far as we can see, historically, when great empires collapse, great wars ensue. That is to say, the power vacuum that occurs with the empire's collapse is quickly filled by violence and by others who want to essentially take claim over that land, that space, that power. We also never run this experiment before in history with nuclear weapons in the mix. So the fact that we did not get a major war at the end of the Cold War is really a historical anomaly. And we should all be surprised in many ways that we made it out so well. And I argue in the book that one of the reasons, not the sole reason, but one of the reasons we made it out so well was because of Bush's quiet, thoughtful diplomacy behind the scenes, essentially keeping the international system going and keeping international tensions calm during a period of tremendous flux.
It shows you, too, that he kept his ego under control because he wasn't really looking for all of the glamour, etc. I looked at the components of success in that war, and if I go through them, we've done almost the opposite in the Second Iraq War or other: coalition building, overwhelming force, limited goals, and it was even paid for by the other partners. How about that?
It is really a model of the way that the American people and the American military in particular thought was the ideal way to fight wars coming out of Vietnam. That is to say, if the central problem in Vietnam from the military's historical perspective was that we did not have popular public support, we didn't have political support, and we didn't have the ability to use all the force at our disposal for some limited aims. That is to say, we had not really identified America's strategic goal in Vietnam in many ways. All those things were present in the Gulf War, as you said. It's a model for how the United States could use its overwhelming force around the world so long as it didn't try to be too ambitious. I like to say that the difference between the George Bush 41 and the George Bush 43 policies in Iraq come down to a single idea. That is, both of them believed freedom was the future, both of them believed markets were the future, both of them believed the world was going to ultimately turn democratic. Bush 41, the older one, believed that we needed as the United States to keep calm and let history unfold in our direction. Bush 43 and those around him believed that we needed to catalyze history, that we could essentially jumpstart the process. They thought this, of course, because they thought after 9/11 they didn't have a lot of time on their hands in the way that others had. But either way, I think that Bush 43's fundamental divergence from his father is not in the ultimate goals that they had, but in the way they thought the United States could actually manifest those goals in their own lifetime.
Very interesting. And sort of we started with vindication, and we end up maybe there because in the long run, he may look like the prudency may get vindicated of all these risks we're taking right now, which, as you said, are exactly the opposite of where he came from. So you think a one-term president has a chance to be ranked as a top-notch president?
Yeah, the presidential rankings are a lot of fun. I mean, a one-term president is never going to make it to the top, obviously, because they got voted out. I think what we need to remember when we rank presidents is to remember that some of them get dealt a better hand than others. Some of them, of course, will be blamed for the economic crises and the political problems that occurred on their watch, whether it's their fault or not, and some will get credit for great times. The reason I think Bush deserves more credit than he receives currently is because he was dealt an incredibly complex hand and played it incredibly well. Again, I come back to the point that I am astounded that we all survived the end of the Cold War. And it wasn't just because of Bush, but another more belligerent, more argumentative, more bellicose president in the White House at the time would, I think, really have screwed things up. And by screwed things up, I mean started a war that perhaps could have led to a nuclear conflict. I'm really impressed that Bush's restraint is one of the reasons that we're all here to have this conversation today.
I'll tell you, Jeff, you make a better case for him than he makes for himself. Thanks to Jeff Engel, that book again, When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush, The End of the Cold War. Thanks to Jeffrey Engel. Thanks to our national audience for listening. See everybody next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.